Welcome back. It's your host, Gabe Morales, covering another episode in our series on corrupt police and corrections departments across the United States. Some of the information in this episode was included in a book retired Chicago PD gang detective Joe Sparks and I wrote called Chicago-Based Gangs, Young Folks and People. First off, let me state in this episode, as I have in previous episodes, there are thousands of brave and honorable cops serving the city of Chicago. This episode is not about them, but about the ones who dishonored the badge. Officer Sylvester Washington was a guy with a big reputation as being a cold-blooded cop who is documented to have shot at least 9 men on Chicago's South Side. According to legend, just 6 months into his rookie year, in 1934, he caught one hoodlum red-handed who was committing a robbery and engaged in a shootout with him. When the smoke cleared, 5 of Officer Washington's shots hit their mark and killed the culprit. After nearly emptying his 6-shooter revolver, Officer Sylvester Washington started carrying a second handgun for backup, thus earning him the name Two Gun Pete. He eventually traded in his .38 revolvers for pearl-handled .357 Magnums, like he was a black Dirty Harry. One was long-barreled and the other short-barreled. Basically, these were handheld cannons, and his reputation grew even more. Washington ended up being famous in the ghetto for being very cocky, flamboyant, a womanizer, and very foul-mouthed detective who gambled and drank in bars after hours just as hard as he did on the job of Chicago's dangerous streets. When he was hired as one of the few black Chicago cops, his bosses made it very clear that his job was to clean up and clear out bad elements from nightclubs, flop houses, and pool halls in what was called the Black Metropolis, which was the south side of Chicago that was mired in poverty and violence. Washington spent most of his career working out of the 5th District, which held about 200,000 people, a good portion of them who were African American. And the area was nicknamed Bucket of Blood for good reason. Washington not only used his 2 guns, but his fists and his nightstick billy club that he used to beat up people pretty much whenever he felt like it, and he'd get away with it. Police officials stated that officially Washington had gunned down 9 men by 1945, but he later claimed that the number was actually 11. And then he told a news reporter one day that it actually was 12, as he added one more to the count to make it an even dozen. The black press was mostly sympathetic to Washington, and they were looking for good stories. And there was not a lot of black cops back then, so they portrayed him as a fearless, straight-shooting cop who got the job done and got many of the people they feared off the street. Word traveled even outside of Chicago. In Baltimore, the African-American press called him the fabulous Two Gun Pete. But in spite of him getting some well-known bad guys off the street, Washington himself was very ruthless and abusive, cruel and corrupt, yet effective for those times. The Office of Professional Standards handled citizens' complaints against officers. During that time period of 14 years, it was renamed and restructured 4 times. O.W. Wilson initially created the office, which conducted police reviews, in response to the 1960 Somerdale scandal, during which multiple Chicago police officers were involved in a burglary ring. The massive scandal rocked CPD and stunned the public, but this was to be only one of many scandals that followed. Because of guys like Two Gun Pete and other incidents prior to 1960, starting with Chicago Police Superintendent O.W. Wilson in 1960, that continued updating policy up to 1974 under Superintendent James Rockford, Chicago streets were often out of control, and the streets were about to get even hotter, such as the 1966 Humboldt Park riots. William Hanhart was a cop who became the highest known Chicago police official ever convicted of wrongdoing. He was accused of running a very sophisticated crew of jewelry thieves who stole millions of dollars in jewels. It is said that Hanhart worked his way up the ranks to become chief of detectives before he finally pled guilty in October 2001 to running this theft ring that stole over $5 million in gems in the 1980s and 90s. In 2002, when he was finally convicted, federal prosecutors accused him of being in the outfit's pocket for virtually his entire career. It is said that Hanhart had any ability to solve many crimes, thus why he was put in charge of the detective section. And it is very likely that underworld figures gave him tips on their rivals, which made him look good. But all the while, he looked the other way while they were doing their dirt. After retiring from Chicago PD in 1986, Hanhart admitted that he tapped a Chicago police sergeant and detective to acquire law enforcement computer data to help him and his crew carry out these jewel heists. It is said that he was also involved in the importation of cocaine from South America. Hanhart died in 2016 at the age of 88 years old. John Burge was a former Chicago police detective who is said to have overseen the torture of hundreds of black men, resulting in many false confessions between 1972 and 1991. Burge was the leader of a group known as the Midnight Group, also called Burge's Ass Kickers or the A-Team. Investigators found that Burge would often burn suspects with radiators, cigarettes, viciously beating them and suffocating them, whatever it took, even sometimes electrocuting their testicles. Although he was later protected by the statute of limitations, he was convicted of lying or perjury about conducting these tortures in at least 118 documented cases of people held in police custody in order to induce false confessions. Burge was acquitted of any wrongdoing in 1989 due to a hung jury. He was suspended from the Chicago Police Department in 1991 and fired from the department in 1993. In 2008, the Department of Justice charged Burge with obstruction of justice and perjury in relation to his 2003 court testimony in a civil lawsuit that was placed against him by his victims. Burge was convicted on all counts in June 2010 and sentenced to serve 4.5 years in federal prison. He was released in October 2014.
Judy, John Graham Burge hadn't been a Chicago police officer in 25 years, but even at the end was still considered the most notorious CPD name ever. Burge was 70 years old and living near Tampa, Florida, which is where the I-Team has learned he died.
I don't know that John Burge got a fair shake based on the years and years and years of service he gave the city.
Former police union president Dean Angelo broke the news of Burge's death, and a few minutes later, current union leadership put out a statement of condolence to his family and saying that the full story of the Burge cases has never been told. Many Chicagoans knew all they needed to know about Burge. These tools of torture that investigators and prosecutors said Burge and his underlings used to extract confessions, mostly at the expense of young African-American men.
As a person, may his soul rest in peace. As a policeman, he did a lot of harm to a lot of people and left on this today mark. It stains us for a long time.
Burge and several other detectives were accused by community leaders and authorities of abusive questioning during the 1970s and 80s that cost Chicago taxpayers more than $100 million in lawsuit settlements and cost the entire department a slice of its reputation. But he was never prosecuted on actual torture charges. In 2010, Burge was convicted in federal court only of perjury and obstruction of justice after lying about torture in connection with a lawsuit.
John Burge put a lot of bad guys in prison that belonged to be there. They're supposed to be there. People picked a career part that was considered for a long time to be an honorable career and a very effective career.
Joseph Miedzianowski was a Chicago cop labeled among the most corrupt ever. He served both as a police officer and a drug kingpin by using his knowledge of the streets and local gangs to shake down drug dealers. For most of his 22-year career, he was assigned to Chicago PD's Gangs Division, North Unit, while he was running his own drug ring at the same time, and eventually was convicted of running a Chicago to Miami drug operation. My big brother Joe Sparks worked right across from him, and unfortunately, it was a case of guilt by association, and he had to work very hard to clear his name. I always had faith in Joe, and he knows that. You can find more about this controversy in our book. Miedzianowski was eventually convicted of 10 counts in federal court, including drug conspiracy and racketeering in 2001. For almost a decade, it is said that former Chicago PD Sergeant Ronald Watts and his team preyed on innocent people at the Ida B. Wells Public Housing Project, where they extorted their victims and planted drugs and guns on people in order to make cases. These were largely black and low-income residents, stated the Cook County's state attorney, Kim Fox. He was asking, I'd put it demanding, people pay a tax, if you will, she stated. He really carried himself as the top dog in that neighborhood, and people who didn't comply had cases put on them. Local and federal law enforcement were looking into Watts as early as 2004. This just so happened to be the same year that he won Officer of the Month for his division, according to court filings. But it wasn't until 2012 that a member of his crew, Khalat Muhammad, was arrested on federal charges of stealing over $5,000 in government funds from an undercover informant that Watts' cover was blown. In a plea bargain, both Muhammad and Watts pled guilty, receiving 22 months and 18 months respectively. Due to Watts' alleged treachery and corruption, local prosecutors moved to dismiss at least 226 convictions connected to Watts and his team. Collectively, the wrongful prosecutions are said to have cost 183 people sentences of over 450 years as a whole, and that doesn't include probation and other kinds of sentences.
More than a dozen people are no doubt relieved now that their convictions have been vacated. The cases are tied to this man, former Chicago Police Sergeant Ronald Watts, who is accused of planting evidence and fabricating charges. Today in court, a judge threw out the convictions of 19 people. Prosecutors did not oppose the decision.
We were able to provide the relief to right the wrongs of the past. But make no mistake, this is a sorrowful, sorrowful moment, knowing that these individuals will never get that time back in their lives.
Since 2016, the convictions of more than 100 people connected to Watts have been vacated. Later this month, dozens of other cases go before a judge where they are expected to be vacated as well.
An Illinois court claims judge described the scandal as one of the most staggering cases of corruption in the history of Chicago policing, and that Watts and his team could only be described as an enterprise right out of the movie Training Day, a film that I talked about in my Los Angeles Police Department Rampart scandal video. In 2017, CPD placed 15 officers associated with Watts on desk duty. Asked about the case by news reporters, a Chicago PD spokesperson stated that at least 5 of those officers had resigned since 2018. One was later relieved of his police powers, but the other 9 remained on active duty with the department. With Chicago's long tradition of police and political corruption, many people still ask, why aren't these cops in jail? Well, as I described in a lot of previous videos, you have something called the unions to deal with, and they wield a lot of power. Some say too much power. After he was fired from the department and after his release from federal prison, Watts moved to Las Vegas and then later to Arizona, where he tried to keep a low profile. Watts recently blamed all of this mess and his conviction on the anti-cop atmosphere that presently exists in Chicago and America, and that he was a very good, albeit aggressive cop. And he stated that the Fed's case was based on lies and that he only pled guilty in the best interests of his family. Now, I stated in previous videos, my dad's side of the family, his father, my grandfather, lived off and on in the city of Chicago since the 1920s. Yes, there are lots of Mexicans, lots of Latinos who live in Chicago. And unfortunately, a lot of them and a lot of young blacks are gang involved and often caught up in a life of violence and drug use. But the city also has many good places and many good people in and out of uniform. And I continue to stay in contact with my friends in Chi-Town. It is they, the people of Chicago, who have to decide what future policing looks like. And again, while all of these incidents and individuals were a disgrace, we should always remember that there are many honorable, brave, and great officers presently working and who have worked in Chicago. And you can see one of them in his illustrious career here on this channel. I hope you enjoy that episode and this episode and return for many more. For now, this is Gabe Morales signing off for Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians.